Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. In today's video, we're going to talk about slavery and civil rights in America. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell. The enslavement of African peoples and their descendants, along with the prolonged fight for black civil rights and equality, represents one of the most challenging chapters in American history. The arrival of 20 enslaved Africans at Jamestown in 1619 marked the beginnings of an institution that would shape the nation's social, political, and economic structures for generations. Efforts to dismantle this system through activism and war stretched over 2 centuries and touched countless lives, from indentured servitude to racial slavery. In the early colonial period, many Africans came to America as indentured servants, working for a fixed period of typically 4 to 7 years before regaining their freedom. As the 17th century progressed, colonial law began to mark out Africans and their children for lifelong hereditary slavery. By 1705, Virginia had enacted laws determining slave status by declaring that children would inherit the condition of their mother. Over time, Africans and their descendants were denied access to freedom dues, family inheritance, legal marriage, and mechanisms of emancipation available to white indentured servants. As slavery became an exclusively racial caste system, blackness and bondage became synonymous. Slavery takes root and spreads. In the plantation colonies of the Chesapeake and the Low Country of the Carolinas and Georgia, slavery grew dramatically through the 18th century. The massive demand for labor to cultivate tobacco, rice, indigo, and other crops drove the ruthless Atlantic slave trade. Traders forcibly removed 12 to 15 million Africans, with estimates as high as 20 million, with many dying en route to America. By 1790, over 697,000 enslaved people labored in America. The northern colonies also benefited economically from supplying the raw materials for slave ships and processing slave-grown crops. Emancipation came gradually and selectively to the north. New York did not fully abolish slavery until 1827. But the plantation system rooted slavery most deeply in the South. Enslaved people persevered by building family and community networks, maintaining cultural traditions, and occasionally engaging in outright rebellions. Slavery and the American Revolution. The era of the American Revolution posed conflicting pressures on slavery. As the colonists decried British tyranny, enslaved blacks seized on the rhetoric of freedom to demand their own emancipation. The chaos of war enabled many to escape bondage as thousands of slaves fled to the British. Following the 1775 Proclamation of Emancipation by Lord Dunmore, George Washington, and the Continental Army reversed anti-slavery policies to encourage black enlistment with promises of freedom. Yet after the Revolution, while northern states took steps towards gradual emancipation, the invention of the cotton gin made slavery indispensable to the Southern economy. Rather than disappearing, as some founders had optimistically predicted, slavery became more entrenched than ever. Abolitionism and the growth of slavery. With the banning of the Atlantic slave trade in 1808, the domestic slave trade exploded, uprooting 1 million black people in forced migration from the tobacco colonies to the Deep South. Cotton production soared from under 1,000 bales in 1790 to over 4 million by 1860. Over 2 million slaves lived in the U.S. by 1850, overwhelmingly concentrated on plantations in the Black Belt of Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. At the same time, robust abolitionist movements spearheaded by free blacks and white opponents of slavery, most notably William Lloyd Garrison's The Liberator newspaper, emerged in the North. White abolitionists remained a minority as the anti-slavery message met intense hostility, especially after the Nat Turner Revolt of 1831. But uprisings led by Gabriel Prosser, Denmark Vesey, Charles Deslandes, and others kept the resistance spirit alive. Abolitionists employed moral appeals, public lectures, boycotts, underground railroad networks, personal testimony by escaped slaves like Frederick Douglass, and political pressure against authorities who sustained slavery. Division and war. As America expanded westward, controversy erupted over slavery's place in new territories. Northern fears of the slave power grew, as did Southern defensiveness about attacks on the peculiar institution. The balancing acts that had held the Union together began to fray after the Mexican-American War and the Compromise of 1850. With the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, debate over slavery entered a violent new phase. Abraham Lincoln's election in 1860 on a platform of halting slavery's expansion prompted the secession of 11 Southern states. The American Civil War began as a struggle for union but evolved into a battle over slavery itself. President Lincoln embraced emancipation as a war aim with the Emancipation Proclamation of 1863, enabling formerly enslaved men to take up arms for the North. The Union victory and the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery in 1865 finally brought the institution to an end. The failure of Reconstruction emancipation marked just the beginning of the long quest for black freedom and equality. During presidential Reconstruction from 1865 to 1866, former slaveholding states enacted race-neutral laws but denied blacks voting rights and full citizenship. Radical Republicans in Congress demanded more protection for freed people. The 14th and 15th Amendments established African-American civil rights, at least on paper. The Ku Klux Klan and other white terrorists targeted Republican office holders, black leaders, and ordinary freed people across the South. Democrats returned to power on campaigns of racial fear-mongering and vilification of Negro rule. By 1877, federal troops had withdrawn, ending Reconstruction and consigning blacks to subjugation under Jim Crow segregation. The age of Jim Crow. In the half-century after Reconstruction, nearly every aspect of black life was under siege. Starting in the 1890s, Southern states adopted constitutions and statutes stripping African Americans of their political voice and basic citizenship rights. Voting was made difficult or impossible through poll taxes, literacy tests, property requirements, and whites-only primaries. Public facilities practiced total racial segregation and exclusion under separate but equal laws. Lynching and other forms of racial terror served to police the stark lines between white and black existence. The Supreme Court's infamous Plessy v. Ferguson ruling in 1896 constitutionalized segregation. Black achievement and prosperity were severely hampered by inferior, separate schools, discrimination in government services, and exclusion from juries and political office. The Jim Crow system denied African Americans equality, dignity, justice, and opportunity at every turn. Black activism in the Jim Crow era. Yet the black community did not surrender to Jim Crow's dehumanization. Ida B. Wells led an international crusade against lynching. Black newspapers like the Chicago Defender inspired the Great Migration northward. Labor leader A. Philip Randolph organized the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters in 1925. Marcus Garvey's Universal Negro Improvement Association, founded in 1914, promoted black nationalism and pride. The NAACP fought Jim Crow in the courts. African Americans nurtured vibrant cultural, religious, educational, and social institutions serving their own needs, while protesting the racism all around. The triumphs of the civil rights movement. After decades of tireless activism, the civil rights movement achieved monumental victories over legal segregation in the 1950s and 60s. Efforts like the Montgomery bus boycott, the campaigns in Birmingham and Selma, the March on Washington, Freedom Summer, and sweeping civil rights legislation dismantled many of the most visible structures of Jim Crow. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, along with Supreme Court decisions such as Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, struck major blows against segregation. Yet implementing civil rights gains often proved difficult. School and housing integration met stiff white resistance. Grassroots campaigns against poverty, police brutality, and labor exploitation waged by Dr. Martin Luther King, the Black Panthers, and other groups exposed enduring economic and justice barriers.